getting by with a lot of help from their friends. But for how much longer? EU foreign ministers have met in Kiev for the first time as a means of showing support to Ukraine in the aftermath of several signs that the West is growing colder over Ukrainian support. The recent elections in neighbouring Slovakia were won by pro-Russian former Prime Minister Robert Fico, whilst Poland has halted military aid to Ukraine following a diplomatic dispute over grain exports. The US, which has already sanctioned close to $50 billion worth of aid to Ukraine, didn't include more aid as part of its temporary budget. However, the EU has claimed that it will continue to back Ukraine heavily, with a new support package being negotiated in Kiev. But is the West suffering from combat fatigue? Both Poland and the US are looking ahead to elections. Are these policies a sign that the public wants to divest support away from Ukraine? Is there anything more that the EU can do to help Ukraine? Should the West continue to support Ukraine?
All right, gentlemen, so let's get to it. Should the West continue to support Ukraine? As always, we begin with our quick fire, around 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we take the conversation from there. So, Mr. Clifford D. May, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely essential that America and our European allies continue to support the Ukrainian people who are fighting for their freedom, for their sovereignty, for their independence, for their families, quite literally, for their homeland. If there are those who are feeling fatigue, and these are not people who are on the battlefield, the Ukrainians are on the battlefield, right. Americans are not, Europeans are not. If you're feeling fatigue, have a stiff cup of black coffee. The last thing we should want in the U.S. or in Europe is for Vladimir Putin to win. That would be dreadful for all of us.
All right, we'll obviously continue from that point in a split second. Dr. Beck, your thoughts?
Well, I think the question was, should the West? I think we have a trilemma here, even if one grants the initial assumption that Ukraine should win this conflict. So there's this objective, but set against this, we had the economic cost of the war, and then perhaps the risk of conflagration, even of nuclear conflagration. So I would urge caution. I think support should take into account the other two objectives.
Last but not least, Ambassador Ayalon, your thoughts?
Well, I think there is quite a unanimity here that the short answer is yes, because too much is at stake here, Ellie, because leaving the Ukraine just to the device of Putin and the Russians will mean a new world order. Europe and NATO will be under great risk, Taiwan, and I would also say even here, Israel.
All right, and on that note, gentlemen, let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards to engage in a conversation. And Mr. May, I do want to begin with you. Will more Western weapons bring the war closer to an end? Is the Ukrainian counteroffensive at a point where it should, quote unquote, prove itself?
No, it's not at a point where it should prove itself. The Ukrainians have not had all that they need, but but with their courage, with a lot of blood spilled by the Ukrainians, they have prevented the Russian invaders from doing what they intended to do, and still intend to do, which is take over the country. We're not doing this out of charity. We're doing this out of self-interest, and we need to understand that. Is it expensive? Well, yes and no. Consider that the U.S., which has spent more than the Europeans, certainly as a percentage of GDP, but even in any other way, it's about 3.5% of Defense Department spending that has gone to this. The return on investment has been substantial. Wow. America's #2 adversary, one could say the #1 adversary of many European countries, has been decimated in terms of the number of tanks lost, the number of artillery, their military capabilities. Very important to keep in mind, if Putin wins, that's not the end of the day, just as it wasn't the end of the day after he annexed Crimea in 2014, after he took over 2 provinces of Georgia in 2008. If he wins in Ukraine, he will think, what's my next target? Because his goal is to restore the Russian/Soviet empire. If we don't know that, we don't know anything about Vladimir Putin.
You know, it reminds me, Mr. May, a phrase my grandmother used to say, that there's a difference between high price and expensive. Not the same here. Dr. Beck, your take.
Well, I'm not quite so gung-ho. I think it's clear that without Western support, Ukraine couldn't have withstood the initial Russian operation. Now, should the West step up arms support? Well, the idea is Ukraine should win that conflict. I'm not actually quite sure what this may mean. I also think it's very important not to underestimate Russia's resolve in this conflict. I do not think that it will be possible to defeat Russia in Ukraine. I think the Russians are of the view that the very great deal is at stake here, and I can only emphasize the very great risk of conflagration if ever Ukraine were put into a position where they could push back Russia to the original frontiers. I think that'd be a very dangerous situation.
Ambassador Ayalon, help us clear the clutter here, if you will.
Well, I think at the end of the day, what we see really is getting into a war of attrition, if you may. If there was any hope in the West that the, let's say, the spring offense of Ukraine would change or would change the game and maybe push the Russians back. This did not happen. The Ukrainians do not have the wherewithal to do it. On the other hand, the Russians are also themselves quite fatigued and exhausted. But what we see here really is quite a global split where China is supporting, but from afar. China is not quite ready for many reasons to give support, direct support militarily to Russia. But the Russians use today the Iranians, North Korean, and other allies, which have become, I would say, the new axis of evil. And with that, if the West does not continue with its own alliance against Ukraine, then I believe it's going to be a major win for the axis of evil, on a moral ground, but also on territorial and political ground as well.
Yeah, the West and the rest, so to speak. Mr. May, I do want to circle back to you and insist on this point, because there is a question whether the war will ultimately be determined on the battlefield.
Yeah, wars are generally determined on the battlefield, and then the diplomacy actually follows. At the point at which you get to negotiations is the point at which Vladimir Putin decides that Western resolve is a match for his. He doesn't believe that right now. It's not a bad bet on his behalf. He thinks he continues to fight. He refuses to compromise. Don't forget, when this war started, everybody was betting on Russia, and they thought it would take a few days, maybe a few weeks at most. Volodymyr Zelensky said, I don't want to be exfiltrated. I don't want to leave. Give me the ammunitions to defend my homeland.
Right.
The West complied. And what happened? 83% or so of Ukraine is now under Ukrainian control. If there are ever negotiations, there can be decisions on what happens to the Crimea and parts of Donetsk, but you're not going to get to negotiations so long as Putin believes he can do what he wants to do, which is repeal the most fundamental of international laws. And the most fundamental of international laws since World War II has been that you don't wipe out a neighboring state through force of arms. If that's gone, all international law is gone.
Dr. Beck, is that notion gone?
Well, I'd just like to make one point,
please,
which has been very forcefully been made by Professor John Mearsheimer. He simply asserts that every great power claims a sphere of influence. So I think we should ask ourselves what the United States would be doing if, say, one of its neighbors were to move close to an organization or alliance that it itself regards as a security threat. Now, again, my second consideration is the cost of war. I think Ukraine is gradually becoming depopulated, and the cost of the war is having a crippling effect within Europe. the question we have to ask ourselves is whether we'd like to get to a situation where Ukraine would have lost most of its population, whether by emigration or through casualties, and secondly, whether Europe is in an economic position to sustain stepping up military and financial assistance for Ukraine quite considerably.
Well, Ambassador Ayalon, it seems it's many. Please, Mr. May. Yeah.
Look, there is no conceivable way that Vladimir Putin considered NATO an aggressive alliance that was threatening him. You know that's not true. Everyone knows that's not true. And Ukraine was not going to get into NATO, not least because Germany wouldn't have voted for it, and you have to have unanimous consent from all NATO members. So that is just absolute nonsense. Now, I want to ask you also, as a NATO member, which Germany is, if Putin succeeds here, and then he decides, you know what, I have to take southern Lithuania because I need a land bridge to the Russian province called Kaliningrad, what are Germans going to do? Or are you okay with because what Putin would like to do is absolutely crumble NATO. He may be able, if he could do that, are you okay with that? Do you think NATO should dissolve? Is that all right with you?
Could I briefly answer this?
Of course, he was asking you, Dr. Beck.
Yes, thank you. Well, 2 points really. Realistically speaking, I think, and if we take into account the Nord Stream sabotage episode, I think we have to raise a serious question whether Germany is an independent actor in foreign policy. Second point, focusing purely on Germany's economic interests. The truth is that Mrs. Merkel and this government have left Germany in a position where it's highly dependent on Russian gas. From an economic point of view, I do not think that Germany can afford supporting Ukraine for much longer. I'm afraid so. We were too dependent on Russia.
All right, and on that note, whether you agree or disagree, it seems that many more Europeans are asking themselves these very questions. Gentlemen, we're taking a very short break, but obviously we have so much more to unpack right after, so do not go anywhere. A few minutes and we're back with the summit. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Mr. Clifford D. May, Dr. Gunnar Beck, and Ambassador Dani Ayalon. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, the short-term budget deal that prevented the federal government from turning into a pumpkin, essentially, earlier this week, left the future of American aid to Kyiv up in the air. But does it entail more than just that? Let's take a quick listen.
Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, shortly after I win the presidency, I will have the horrible war between Russia and Ukraine settled. It'll be settled very quickly.
And I want to assure our American allies and the American people, the people of Ukraine, that you can count on our support. We will not walk away. The vast majority of both parties, I'll say it again, Democrats and Republicans, Senate and House, support helping Ukraine and the brutal aggression that's being thrust upon them by Russia. Stop playing games. Get this done.
All right, gentlemen, let's get to it. Another quick round, 30 seconds each, and we take it from there. How will the U.S. election impact Ukraine, or the election campaign for the time being? Dr. Beck, please take the lead.
Well, I cannot answer you that question. I'm no expert on US politics. Both my interlocutors are probably in a better position to answer that question. The general view in Europe is that if Trump were to win the US election, there's probably a greater chance of bringing this conflict to an end. Under a different Republican candidate or under the Biden administration, I think there's less of a chance. That's a general view in Europe.
All right, Ambassador Ayalon, the view from your side?
Yeah, I think we have seen it quite vividly. The clip you have shown, I would say the diametrically opposing views of Trump and Biden, which shows really that if the Republicans wins the White House, we are going to see a new or a neo-isolationist by the United States, which will not bode well for Europe and American allies worldwide.
Mr. Clifford Dime, wrap it up for us, please.
Yeah, first of all, we have no idea even who's going to run in this election, much
Right.
less how it's going to come out. And if you listen to President Trump, now ex-President Trump, all he said was he was going to settle it. He didn't say he was going to pull out. We don't actually know what he would do if he becomes president. I'm not sure he knows what he would do if he becomes president. I do want to follow up on my question to Dr. Beck. If I heard him correctly, I agree with him that under Merkel, Germany became very, very dependent on Russia for its energy needs. That was a terrible mistake. I thought I heard him say he wants Germany to again become dependent on Russia for its energy needs and is not concerned about the possible dissolution of the NATO alliance.
Well, I think at present we have no alternative because Mrs. Merkel also phased out nuclear energy, and she single-handedly decided, and the current government is following her in that respect, to save the world's climate with a share well, Germany has a share of world CO2 emissions of about 1.8%. So given the context of our suicidal policy in the last 10 to 15 years, I'm afraid we have little option. That doesn't mean that I'd like to continue our dependency on Russian gas inevitably. But you see, we are in an unenviable position here as a result of two governments that have prioritized solving the world's problems over our own.
And NATO, do you value the alliance or not so much?
It's yes, we value it as one of several objectives. So obviously, there's a degree of maneuver we have, and I think we shouldn't be overzealous. And I think for Germany, settling this conflict, as you call it, is an economic priority. I'm simply stating the economic facts governing my country, I'm afraid.
There is, Eli,
Yes,
if
don't
I may.
confuse settling the conflict. Don't
Please,
confuse
Ambassador
settling the
Ayalon.
conflict with allowing Putin to win, because he will go on and there will be threats to your neighbors and possibly to you after that.
Well, Eli,
I believe
watch.
in the possibility of compromise.
Ambassador Ayalon, please chime in. Yeah.
No, it's quite amazing. I really watch with great interest the discourse between Dr. Beck and my good old friend from Washington, Cliff May. And I would like to add the Israeli angle here, which is quite important. You know, just 2 days ago, there was a deal signed, which was worth $3.5 billion, where Germany bought the first battery of Israeli Arrow, which shows in my mind the determination of Germany to defend itself if they need to even to defy Russia, notwithstanding this oil or economic dependence, which I think is going to actually go and dwindle. And for that reason, I believe that Germany will continue to be a major building block in the, let's say, in the alliance against Russia.
Let me pick up another point off Danny's point, and that is, if the prohibition against wiping out your neighbors by military force is repealed successfully by President Putin, that will have huge ramifications for what Xi Jinping decides to do vis-a-vis Taiwan and others of his neighbors in Asia, and also the Islamic Republic of Iran, which already has made vassal states out of Lebanon, Syria, and is attempting to do the same in Yemen and Iraq. That has consequences for Israel, it seems to me.
Yeah, and gentlemen, as we are nearing the end of our discussion, maybe the working assumption here might be tweaked a bit, because the Western raison d'etre, if you will, at since day one was to stick with Ukraine until the end. But is the West's end at this point in time is the same end for Ukraine, Mr. May?
I'm not sure I quite understand. What I do think is that go ahead.
No, please. You will clarify me better than I do. That's for certain.
What I would say is simply this: that the people of Ukraine, the nation of Ukraine, the independence of Ukraine should be of importance to people in free countries of the West. And therefore, we should support their self-defense against an invading army that seeks to wipe this nation off the earth. If we do not, that will not be the end of the story.
Ambassador Ayalon?
Well, I think that at the end of the day, we're going to see a Kissingerian kind of solution,
exactly.
whereby the United States, let's say, international community, let the two warring sides pound at each other until they're all exhausted, and then there will be some kind of a political deal. I'm afraid in this political deal, Ukraine will have to pay some territory, and the Russians will pay in kind as well.
Dr. Beck?
I think I tend to agree with the ambassador's perspective, but he too mentions that there'll be a deal only once both parties are exhausted. I'd like to say, if possible, we shouldn't even get to that point. I'm not sure that the West's interest in defeating Russia, assuming that's what it is, entirely coheres with Ukraine's interest. Ukraine has no interest in a long, drawn-out, gruesome conflict.
So, Dr. May, we do have, Mr. May, we do have a few seconds left. Maybe I will try to clarify myself again. Should the White House have a clear definition of what a victory for Ukraine means?
The Ukrainians have a clear definition. They want Russian troops out of their country. They want Russian troops no longer raping their women. They want Russian troops no longer stealing Ukrainian children, about 400,000 so far, and taking them to Russia. They want their territorial independence. Is it possible that at the end of the negotiations it won't be that good? Of course, a lot of things are possible, but we should support the Ukrainians who have been attacked unjustly, unprovoked, by a foreign army. If we say, oh, well, these things happen, they will happen again, and that will have ramifications for the U.S., for Israel, for Germany.
Hey, I see you liked it. Want more? Just hit the subscribe button right here. Go on. I know you want to.